Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Wendigo, the North Woods of Minnesota. While this creature is considered by many to be the creation of horror writer Algernon Blackwood in his classic terror tale, The Wendigo, this wood spirit was, and is, very real to many in the northern woods and prairies of the state. Many legends and stories have circulated over the years about a mysterious creature who was encountered by hunters and campers in the shadowy forests of the upper regions of Minnesota. In one variation of the story, the creature could only be seen if it faced the witness head-on, because it was so thin that it could not be seen from the side. The spirit was said to have a voracious appetite for human flesh, and the many forest dwellers who disappeared over the years were said to be victims of the monster. The American Indians had their own tales of the Wendigo, dating back so many years that most who were interviewed could not remember when the story had not been told. The Inuit Indians of the region called the creature by various names, including Wendigo, Widigo, Widiko and Wee-Go, but each of them was roughly translated to mean the evil spirit that devours mankind. Around 1860, a German explorer translated Wendigo to mean cannibal among the tribes along the Great Lakes. Native American versions of the creature spoke of a gigantic spirit, over 15 feet tall, that had once been human but had been transformed into a creature by the use of magic. Though all of the descriptions of the creature vary slightly, the Wendigo is generally said to have glowing eyes, long yellowed fangs and overly long tongues. Most have a sallow, yellowish skin, but others are said to be matted with hair. They are tall and lanky and are driven by a horrible hunger. But how would a person grow to become one of this strange creatures? According to the lore, the Wendigo is created whenever a human resorts to cannibalism to survive. In years past, such a practice was possible, although still rare, as many of the tribes and settlers in the region were cut off by the bitter snows and ice of the North Woods. Unfortunately, eating another person to survive was sometimes resorted to, and thus, the legend of the Wendigo was created. But how real were, or are, these creatures? Could the legend of the Wendigo have been created merely as a warning against cannibalism? Or could sightings of Bigfoot-type creatures have created the stories? While this is unknown, it is believed that white settlers to the region took the stories seriously. At times, they even took the sightings and reports quite seriously and made it enough of the local culture that stories like those of Algernon Blackwood were penned. Real-life stories were told as well, and according to the settlers' version of the legend, the Wendigo would often be seen banshee-like to signal a death in the community. A Wendigo allegedly made a number of appearances near a town called Roseau in northern Minnesota from the late 1800s through the 1920s. Each time that it was reported, an unexpected death followed, and finally, it was seen no more. Even into the last century, Native Americans actively believed in, and searched for, the Wendigo. One of the most famous Wendigo hunters was a Cree Indian named Jack Fiddler. He claimed to kill at least 14 of the creatures in his lifetime, although the last murder resulted in his imprisonment at the age of 87. In October 1907, Fiddler and his son, Joseph, were tried for the murder of a Cree Indian woman. They both pleaded guilty to the crime but defended themselves by stating that the woman had been possessed by the spirit of a Wendigo and was on the verge of transforming into one entirely. According to their defense, she had to be killed before she murdered other members of the tribe. There are still many stories told of Wendigos that have been seen in northern Ontario, near the Cave of the Wendigo, and around the town of Kenora, where a creature has been spotted by traders, trackers and trappers for decades. There are many who still believe that the Wendigo roams the woods and the prairies of northern Minnesota and Canada. Whether it seeks human flesh, or acts as a portent of coming doom, is anyone's guess, but before you start to doubt that it exists, remember that the stories and legends of this fearsome creature have been around since before the white man walked on these shores. The legends had to have gotten started somehow, didn't they?
Name: Two-Face. Tribal affiliation: Cheyenne, Sioux, Omaha. Native names: Estovae, Cheyenne; Anuk Ite, Winyan Nupa, Sioux, also known as double face, sharp elbows, two faces, etc. Type: monster. Related figures in other tribes: sharp elbows, Iowa; red woman, Crow; headless man, Wichita. Two-Face is a malevolent humanoid monster of the Plains Indian tribes. In some tribes, two-faces are described as ogres, but most often the two-face resembles a human except for having a second face on the back side of his or her head. If people make eye contact with this second face, they will either be struck dead or paralyzed with fear until the two-face returns to murder them. In some traditions there is only one two-face, female in some tribes and male in others, while other traditions suggest a whole race of two-faces. The misdeeds of Two-Face range from murdering and mutilating people, to cannibalism, to kidnapping, or even just frightening misbehaving children. In some Sioux legends, Double-Face Woman is to blame for childhood fits and night terrors. In Omaha mythology, it is a Two-Face who kills the pregnant mother of the twin heroes.
The Cherokee legend of Uktena. Long ago, Hilahiu Jigas, when the sun became angry at the people on earth and sent a sickness to destroy them, the little men changed a man into a monster snake, which they called Uktena, the keen-eyed, and sent him to kill her, the sun. He failed to do the work, and the rattlesnake had to be sent instead, which made the Uktena so jealous and angry that the people were afraid of him and had him taken up to Galunlati, to stay with the other dangerous things. He left others behind him, though, nearly as large and dangerous as himself, and they hide now in deep pools in the river and about lonely passes in the high mountains, the places the Cherokees call where the Uktena stays. Those who know say the Uktena is a great snake, as large around as a tree trunk, with horns on its head, and a bright blazing crest like a diamond on its forehead, and scales glowing like sparks of fire. It has rings or spots of color along its whole length, and cannot be wounded except by shooting in the seventh spot from the head, because under this spot are its heart and its life. The blazing diamond is called Ulansuti, transparent, and he who can win it may become the greatest wonder worker of the tribe. But it is worth a man's life to attempt it, for whoever is seen by the Uktena is so dazed by the bright light that he runs toward the snake instead of trying to escape. Even to see the Uktena asleep is death, not to the hunter himself, but to his family. Of all the daring warriors who have started out in search of the Ulansuti, only a Ganunatsi ever came back successful. The East Cherokee still keep the one that he brought. It is a large transparent crystal, nearly the shape of a cartridge bullet, with a blood-red streak running throughout the center from top to bottom. The owner keeps it wrapped in a whole deerskin, inside an earthen jar hidden away in a secret cave in the mountains. Every 7 days he feeds it with the blood of small game, rubbing the blood all over the crystal as soon as the animal has been killed. Twice a year it must have the blood of a deer or other large animal. Should he forget to feed it at the proper time, it would come out of its cave in a shape of fire and fly through the air to slake its thirst with the lifeblood of the conjurer or some one of his people. He may save himself from this danger by telling it, when he puts it away, that he will not need it again for a long time. It will then go quietly to sleep and feel no hunger until it is again brought forth to be consulted. Then it must be fed again with blood before it is used. No white man must ever see it, and no person, but the owner will venture near it for fear of sudden death. Even the conjurer who keeps it is afraid of it, and changes its hiding place every once in a while so it cannot learn the way out. When he dies it will be buried with him. Otherwise it will come out of its cave, like a blazing star, to search for his grave, night after night for 7 years, when, if still not able to find him, it will go back to sleep forever where he has placed it. Whoever owns the Ulansuti is sure of success in hunting, love, rainmaking, and every other business, but its great use is in life prophecy. When it is consulted for this purpose, the future is seen mirrored in the clear crystal as a tree is reflected in the quiet stream below it, and the conjurer knows whether the sick man will recover, whether the warrior will return from battle, or whether the youth will live to be old.
Name: Flying Head, also known as Whirlwind, Big Head. Tribal affiliation: Iroquois, Wyandot. Native names: Kanansistantes, Kuninryanen, Dagwanoye, etc. Type: monster, undead creature. Related figures in other tribes: Rolling Head, Plains tribes. Flying heads are undead monsters from the legends of the Iroquois tribes. The flying head appears as a huge, disembodied head with fiery eyes and long, tangled hair. They fly through the air, pursuing humans to chase and devour. The origins of flying heads vary greatly from story to story. In some tales, a flying head is created from a violent murder scene. The severed head of a victim grows to enormous size, or the head emerges from a mass grave. In others, a human is transformed into a flying head after committing an act of cannibalism. In many stories, the origin of flying heads is not remarked on at all. They are primordial monsters whose nature is to eat humans, but occasionally have other motivations of their own. Flying heads are associated with whirlwinds in many Iroquois communities. Names such as Kanansistantes and Kuninryanen mean flying head, while names such as Dagwanwanyan literally mean whirlwind.
The origin of bats. The Ayaze family was a large family. They lived in a camp. Very often they used to go picking berries, for their country was a rocky country where berries abounded. Very often some of the berry pickers would get lost and never be found again. It was thought that some creature made a prey of them and ate them. One time one of the Ayaze men was traveling. On his way he came across a kind of cabin of rock, from the top of which smoke was rising and in front of which a number of human skulls hung in the opening. Now this Ayaze managed to enter. By being very careful and not touching the skulls, he gained the inside of the rock house without making any noise. These skulls were put there to rattle when anybody tried to pass. When Ayaze got inside, he beheld 2 old blind women. As soon as they became aware of his presence, one of them said, "We had better begin to cook something and we will find out if Ayaze is passing here." Now these old women had some grease in a bark dish and one of them put some of the grease in a cooking pail. When she did this, Ayaze pulled it out with his hand and ate it. Then she took the spoon to taste her grease, but found it gone. So, she put another lump in the dish. Ayaze took this, and when she started to dip it in, it too was gone. This happened 3 or 4 times. At last the old woman said, "Ayaze must have passed. Somebody told us that Ayaze was going to pass. He must have passed now." Then she took a stick which she used to poke the fire with and began feeling all around, poking in the corners of the wigwam to find if Ayaze were there. Every time she came near poking him, he moved to another part of the wigwam, so she could not reach him. Pretty soon she touched him with the poker and then he took off his coat of fisher skin which he was wearing and threw it into a doorway. The old women jumped up, and when they felt the fur coat, they thought it was Ayaze trying to escape through the door. Now these old women had a sharp pointed bone at each elbow. With this pointed bone they began stabbing the fur coat in their haste to kill Ayaze, and pretty soon in their blind fury they fell stabbing each other, each one thinking she was stabbing Ayaze. They killed each other. One of the old women said before she died, "I believe you hit me by mistake." It was too late, they both died. Now Ayaze in the wigwam sat down and looked at them a long time. Then he dragged them outside and looked at them a long time. All around the wigwam he saw the men's and women's bones, the bones of the victims of these two old blind women. Then he knew that all of his lost people had been killed by the old women and eaten. They were cannibals in the shape of monster bats, large enough to kill and eat people. Then Ayaze took their bodies and cut them up into small pieces. Then he threw them into the air, and they sailed off, transformed into small bats as we see them today.
Name: Big Owl. Tribal affiliation: Apache. Also known as Giant Owl Man, Old Man, Big Owl Man, Big Owl Monster, etc. Type: Giant. Antagonist: Owl. Big Owl is a malicious and dangerous giant often used as a boogeyman in children's stories. In some Apache tribes, Big Owl also plays a more important mythological role as an early adversary of the War Twins. Like other legendary Apache beings, Big Owl is sometimes described as having human form, in this case a man-eating ogre, and other times animal form, in this case a horned owl large enough to carry off a child. Apache legend speaks of Big Owl, a man-eating ogre that often functions as a boogeyman figure in children's stories. More recently, eyewitnesses from southern Texas and Mexico have reported an owl monster called Lechuza, which is often seen in connection with deaths and unusual, unexplained events. The Lechuza legend is as alive as ever today. Residents along the Texas-Mexico border still report seeing the ominous owls before car trouble or other strange, unexplained events. Legend has it that the Lechuza is really a witch or the spirit of an annoyed woman who can choose to turn into an owl at will.
Legend of Lechuza, possibly seen in Carrizo Springs. The legend of the Lechuza has been told in this area for years. Now, a recent picture has sparked a discussion about whether the picture is real. The picture, believed to have been taken in Carrizo Springs, shows two men holding a white owl with a very large wingspan. The picture has definitely got people interested whether or not they believe in the myth. We spoke to one of the owners of Petland who tells us this picture has her baffled when it comes to classifying the type of owl. I think people would like to believe it's real just like they'd like to believe Bigfoot's real and the Loch Ness Monster and all the other creatures. Owner of Petland Laredo, Laura Haddon, gives us her take on the picture that's been circulating social networking sites for the past few days. The picture was taken in Carrizo Springs. Many people are calling the big white bird Lechuza from the urban legend commonly told in the Mexican heritage where the spirit of a woman or a witch turns into an owl. Those wise tales are there for a reason. They are a legend. Perhaps there at one time was a much larger species of an owl that was here. Haddon says it looks like a barn owl but is way too large. She says it's really hard to determine the exact species by the undercarriage. By looking at the picture, she says it's hard to tell if it is indeed real or fake. The head is really out of focus, so it makes you wonder about Photoshop. But the wings itself look like a barn owl. One thing Haddon says doesn't add up is the size of the bird. The size doesn't make any sense for the species of an owl because even the largest, a great horned owl, doesn't look anything like it and it's still way smaller. Just like other legends in South Texas like the Chupacabra, there's no way of telling if this is a real Lechuza or not. I think they'd like it to be the Lechuza, because I find the culture here to be full of mysticism and people enjoy it. Pro 8 News Chicano Folklore, a guide to the folktales, traditions, rituals and religious practices of Mexican Americans Zulema and the Witch Owl, Zulema y la Bruja Lechuza.
Name: Cannibal Dwarves. Tribal affiliation: Arapaho, Gros Ventre, Cheyenne. Native names: Hesasiitehi, Arapaho, Voestanehasono, Cheyenne. Pronunciation: in Arapaho, Heachasseetehi, the first syllable rhymes with yeah. In Cheyenne, similar to voh sta ne hesoh no. Also known as enemy dwarves. Type: Native American little people, antagonists. Related figures in other tribes: Nimaragar, Shoshone, Awakule, Crow, Pukwudgie, Wampanoag. Although benign races of small magical creatures exist in many Native American tribes, the little people of the Arapahoes and neighboring tribes, also known as cannibal dwarves or enemy dwarves, are dangerous man-eaters and particular enemies of the Arapaho tribe. Their Arapaho name, Hesasiitehi, literally means little people. Tihaihan comes from the Arapaho word for strong. Arapaho dwarves are said to have superhuman strength. In some texts they are referred to as Nimaragar instead, which is a name borrowed from the neighboring Shoshone tribe, who had similar legends about ferocious little people. Descriptions of the cannibal dwarves vary somewhat from community to community, but they are usually said to be the size of children, dark-skinned, and extremely aggressive. Some storytellers say that they had the power to turn themselves invisible, while others say they were hard to spot simply because they moved with incredible speed. Some suggest that the dwarves' warlike temperament comes because they must be killed in battle to reach the dwarf afterworld. Others believe that they were gluttons who habitually killed more than they could eat just because they could. According to most versions of the story, the race of cannibal dwarves was destroyed in an ancient war with the Arapahoes and other allied Native American tribes. Cannibal dwarves have a long oral history among the Arapaho, Gros Ventre, and Cheyenne nations. Legends report that these little people are bloodthirsty, child-sized creatures. Also known as Tihaihan, which means strong in the Arapaho language, cannibal dwarves surprisingly fierce fighters who are fast enough to outrun an Arapaho warrior. While cannibal dwarves might be insanely fast and strong, they're also a bit dense. According to one story published in the Handbook of Native Mythology, a warrior was captured by a cannibal dwarf, so to delay the inevitable, he tried to strike up a conversation. Noticing dwarf hearts hanging on the walls around him, the warrior asked what the gruesome organs were. The dwarf told him that they were the hearts of his relatives, who were out hunting at the time. The warrior then pierced the hearts one by one. The dwarf wasn't sharp enough to realize that piercing those hearts would kill his family. With a final stroke, the warrior pierced the heart of the dwarf who was holding him captive last, and the dwarf who wanted to eat him immediately dropped dead.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.